They thought they were squatting in a crumbling mansion just to survive the winter. But what this elderly couple found beneath the tennis court would expose a secret worth $275 million. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The Mediterranean sun had long since abandoned Harold and Margaret Cole. Not literally, of course. The sun still hung golden over Mallorca's hills every morning, painting the olive groves in shades of amber and honey. But the warmth it offered couldn't reach the cold place that had settled in their bones. The kind of cold that comes not from weather, but from loss, from shame, from watching everything you built over a lifetime crumble into dust while the world keeps spinning like nothing happened. Harold was 73 years old. His hands, once steady enough to wire entire buildings, now trembled slightly when he poured his morning coffee. Margaret was 71, her silver hair pulled back in the same simple bun she'd worn for 40 years, her reading glasses perpetually perched on the edge of her nose, even when there was nothing left to read. They had been married for 49 years. They had raised 2 children. They had done everything right, and now they were homeless. The road that led them here wound back through 5 years of quiet devastation. In 2019, they had sold their modest home in Tucson, Arizona, a 3-bedroom ranch with a backyard garden Margaret had tended for decades, and used the proceeds, along with their combined retirement savings of $420,000, to move to Mallorca. It was supposed to be their golden chapter. Harold had always dreamed of living somewhere with history, with ancient stone walls and church bells that rang at noon. Margaret had wanted olive trees and the smell of the sea. They found a small apartment in a village called Santa Ponsa. Nothing fancy, just 2 bedrooms with a terrace overlooking the harbor. Harold fixed things for neighbors to stay busy. Margaret volunteered at a local library teaching English to Spanish children. They were happy, genuinely, quietly happy. Then came the man in the linen suit. His name was David, or at least that's what he called himself. He appeared at their church, charming and articulate, speaking perfect English with just a hint of European polish. He talked about investment opportunities, about a fund that had consistently returned 15% annually for over a decade. He showed them paperwork, testimonials, even introduced them to other retirees who had supposedly doubled their money. Harold was skeptical at first. He'd spent 40 years as an electrician and knew that nothing worked perfectly forever. But Margaret had noticed how their savings were dwindling faster than expected. The cost of living had risen. Their social security didn't stretch as far in euros, and David was so reassuring, so patient with their questions. They invested everything, every last dollar they had managed to save over a lifetime of hard work. The fund collapsed 18 months later. David vanished. The Spanish authorities called it one of the largest Ponzi schemes targeting foreign retirees in the Balearic Islands' history. Over 300 people lost their life savings. The total? Nearly $90 million, gone like smoke. Harold and Margaret were left with nothing. Their apartment lease ran out. Their children back in the States offered to help, but both were struggling themselves. One going through a divorce, the other buried in student loans from a graduate degree that hadn't led anywhere. Harold and Margaret couldn't bring themselves to become burdens on kids who were barely keeping their own heads above water. Pride, that old devil, kept them silent. For nearly a year, they survived on the margins. They slept in their aging Volkswagen for 3 months, parked in different spots each night to avoid suspicion. They ate at church food pantries and accepted handouts from strangers who didn't know they were once people who gave handouts themselves. Harold's health began to fail. His back, damaged from decades of climbing ladders, screamed at him every morning. Margaret developed a persistent cough that wouldn't go away. Winter was approaching. The nights in Mallorca grew cold, colder than the tourists in their beach resorts ever imagined. and Harold knew, with the grim certainty of a man who had faced hard truths his whole life, that they would not survive another month sleeping in the car. That's when they found the villa. It sat at the end of a winding road in the hills above Palma, hidden behind overgrown hedges and a rusted iron gate that hung half open on its hinges. Harold noticed it one afternoon while driving aimlessly through the countryside, burning the last of their fuel on a journey to nowhere. The gate was wrapped in chains, but the chains had rusted through years ago, crumbling at the slightest touch. Beyond the gate stretched a gravel driveway, choked with weeds and fallen branches. And at the end of that driveway, barely visible through the tangle of bougainvillea and wild olive trees, rose a mansion. Not a house. A mansion. Harold stopped the car and stared. The structure was massive, easily 15,000 square feet, built in the Mediterranean style with terracotta roof tiles and cream-colored stucco walls. But it was clearly abandoned. Windows were shuttered. Vines crawled up the facade like green fingers reaching for the sky. The fountain in the circular drive had long since run dry, its basin filled with dead leaves and the skeleton of a bird. "Harold," Margaret whispered from the passenger seat, "what is this place?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. Because something about this forgotten estate called to him, not with words, but with the silent language of possibility. They sat in the car for nearly an hour, watching, waiting. No one came. No security guards, no caretakers, no curious neighbors. The road behind them remained empty. The only sound was the wind rustling through the abandoned gardens. Finally, Harold made a decision that would change everything. "Let's take a look," he said. They walked through the gate together, Margaret clutching his arm the way she always did when she was nervous. The gravel crunched beneath their worn shoes. The air smelled of wild rosemary and something older, mustier, the scent of a place that had been sleeping for a very long time. The front door was locked, but Harold found a service entrance on the side of the house, hidden behind a row of cypress trees. The lock was old, mechanical, the kind he had picked dozens of times during his career when clients lost their keys. Within 2 minutes, they were inside. The darkness swallowed them. Harold pulled out the small flashlight he kept in his pocket, a habit from his electrician days, and swept the beam across the space. They were standing in a kitchen, a massive kitchen with marble countertops and copper pots still hanging from an overhead rack. Dust covered everything like a grey blanket. But beneath that dust, Harold could see quality. Expensive tile floors, custom cabinetry, appliances that had cost more than his first car. "Someone lived well here," Margaret murmured. They moved through the house slowly, room by room, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The scale of the place was overwhelming. A living room with ceilings that soared 20 feet high, a dining room with a table that could seat 14, a library with empty shelves and a fireplace large enough to stand in, bedrooms with 4-poster beds still made, their linens moth-eaten but intact, and everywhere that same eerie sense of abandonment, as if the owner had simply walked out one day and never returned. "Harold," Margaret said softly, stopping in front of a glass display case in the main hallway. "Look at this." Harold approached and shone his flashlight through the dusty glass. Inside were trophies, golden cups and silver plates arranged on velvet stands. He leaned closer, squinting at the engraving on the largest one. "Wimbledon men's singles champion," he read aloud, 1985. Margaret's breath caught. "Wimbledon? That's tennis, isn't it?" Harold nodded slowly, moving his light to another trophy. "Australian Open, 1991, US Open, 1989. He paused, his beam settling on a nameplate at the base of the case. The letters were ornate, Gothic, unmistakable. "Boris Becker," Harold whispered. Margaret put her hand to her mouth. "The tennis player? That Boris Becker?" How many Boris Beckers have won Wimbledon? They stood in stunned silence, the weight of the discovery pressing down on them. Boris Becker. the German tennis legend, the man who had won 6 Grand Slam titles, who had been ranked #1 in the world, whose face had graced magazine covers and television screens throughout the 1980s and 90s. They were standing in his house. "I read something about him," Margaret said slowly, her librarian's memory stirring. "Years ago, there was a scandal. He went bankrupt, didn't he? Owed millions. I think he even went to prison." Harold remembered too. Vague headlines glimpsed on news sites, stories about hidden assets and unpaid debts. The golden boy of tennis, fallen from grace. "If he went bankrupt," Harold said carefully, "then this house might not be his anymore," Margaret finished. "It might belong to creditors, to banks, to lawyers." They looked at each other in the dim light, 2 elderly Americans standing in the abandoned mansion of a disgraced sports legend, and the same thought crossed both their minds simultaneously. No one was coming here. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. That first night, they slept in the library. Harold built a small fire in the massive fireplace using dry branches he gathered from the garden, and they huddled together on a dusty sofa, wrapped in curtains they had pulled from the windows. It was warmer than the car. It was warmer than anything they had felt in months. Margaret cried softly against his shoulder. "We're trespassing," she whispered. "I know," Harold said. "This is wrong. I know." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "But we're alive." Harold held her tighter. "We're alive." They expected to be discovered within days. Every morning, Harold would walk to the front gate and scan the road for approaching vehicles. Every evening, Margaret would peer through the shuttered windows, watching for lights in the distance. But no one came. The villa remained forgotten, lost in its tangle of overgrown gardens, invisible to a world that had moved on. A week passed, then 2, then a month. Slowly, cautiously, they began to settle in. Harold's electrician instincts took over. He found the main breaker panel in the basement and discovered that the power had been shut off at the meter, not disconnected from the grid. With some careful rewiring and a prayer to whoever might be listening, he managed to restore electricity to a single wing of the house, just enough to run a few lights and the ancient refrigerator in the kitchen. The water was trickier. The pipes had been drained to prevent freezing, and the pump was dead. But there was a well on the property, a hand pump well that dated back to when the villa was first built in the 1960s. Harold repaired it over the course of a week, replacing seals and clearing debris until clear water flowed again. Margaret, meanwhile, claimed the kitchen as her domain. She scrubbed the counters and polished the copper pots. She found canned goods in the pantry, mostly expired, but some still safe, and foraged vegetables from what had once been a kitchen garden. The herbs had gone wild, but rosemary and thyme and oregano still grew in fragrant abundance. She made soups and stews, simple meals that tasted like heaven after months of gas station sandwiches and food bank rations. They took one bedroom on the second floor, the smallest one they could find, as if claiming anything larger would be too presumptuous. Harold repaired the bed frame and mattress. Margaret hung fresh curtains she made from old sheets. They slept in a real bed for the first time in over a year, and slowly the fear began to fade. The locals in the nearby village knew about the villa, of course. Harold discovered this during careful, cautious conversations at the small market, where he sometimes bought bread and cheese with the few euros they had left. An old woman who sold vegetables mentioned the place once, crossing herself as she did. La Casa del Tenista, she called it. The tennis player's house. Nadie va allí. Nobody goes there. Why not? Harold asked. The old woman shrugged. Mala suerte. Bad luck. The man who lived there, he lost everything, his money, his reputation, his freedom. People say the house is cursed now, that bad things happen to anyone who touches it. Harold said nothing. He bought his bread and returned to the villa, where Margaret was hanging laundry on a line strung between 2 olive trees, looking more at peace than she had in years. Cursed? Perhaps. But for two people who had already lost everything, what more was there to fear? 3 months into their stay, Margaret made a discovery that would set everything else in motion. She had been exploring the east wing of the house, areas they had avoided until now. Most rooms were empty, stripped of furniture and personal effects, likely by creditors or liquidators who had taken what they could and abandoned the rest. But one room was different. It was a storage room of sorts, tucked behind what had once been a home gym. The door was locked, but the lock was cheap, and Harold picked it easily when Margaret called him over. Inside they found more trophies, dozens of them. Golden cups and silver plates and crystal awards, all bearing the same name, Boris Becker. There were photographs too, framed and leaning against walls, showing a young man in white tennis clothes raising his arms in victory on courts around the world. But that wasn't what caught Margaret's attention. In the corner of the room, beneath a drop cloth that had turned grey with age, she found a filing cabinet. And inside that filing cabinet were documents, bank statements, property records, legal correspondence, all of it in German, which neither of them could read, but the numbers were clear enough. "Harold," Margaret breathed, her voice barely above a whisper, "look at these figures." Harold adjusted his reading glasses and peered at the documents. His eyes widened. "This can't be right." "Millions," Margaret said. "These statements show millions of euros, moving in and out of accounts, transfers to banks in Switzerland, in Liechtenstein, in the Cayman Islands." Harold sat down heavily on an old crate. His mind was racing. If he was bankrupt, if he owed all that money to creditors, then why would there be records showing money being moved around? Margaret finished. Unless... They looked at each other, and the same dark thought crossed both their minds. Unless he was hiding it. The villa took on a different character after that discovery. What had seemed like a forgotten relic now felt like something more sinister, a place with secrets buried in its bones. Harold and Margaret tried to continue their quiet routine, but the documents in that storage room nagged at them like a splinter under the skin. Harold began noticing things he had overlooked before. The way certain rooms had been sealed not just with locks, but with actual construction. Doorways bricked over, windows boarded from the inside. The way one section of the garden, near the tennis court at the rear of the property, looked deliberately neglected, as if someone had wanted it to appear wild and impassable. And then there was the tennis court itself. Harold had walked past it dozens of times without paying much attention. It was a clay court, the red surface faded to pink and cracked with age. Weeds pushed through the baseline. The net had rotted away long ago. Standard stuff for an abandoned estate. But one afternoon, as the sun was setting and the light hit the court at just the right angle, Harold noticed something strange. The concrete pad at one end of the court didn't match. Most tennis courts have a small concrete area near the service line for chairs, towels, that sort of thing. This court had one too, but it was newer than the rest. The color was slightly different, the texture smoother. And more importantly, it was larger than it needed to be, about 12 feet by 12 feet, far bigger than any equipment pad should be. Harold knelt down and brushed away the debris. The concrete was solid professional work, but there was a seam around the edges. Not a crack, a seam. Deliberate, intentional. His electrician's mind started churning. He noticed something else, a small metal grate at one corner of the pad, barely visible beneath the dirt. He cleared it off and found a ventilation cover, the kind you might see on a climate-controlled storage unit. Ventilation for a tennis court. His heart began to beat faster. That evening, he traced the electrical lines running through the property. It was something he'd started doing weeks ago, just out of professional curiosity, mapping the villa's aging electrical system. But now he had a specific purpose. The main panel in the basement fed power to the house, the pool equipment, the exterior lighting, all standard. But there was one line that didn't make sense. A heavy gauge wire, the kind used for high amperage applications, running underground toward the rear of the property, toward the tennis court. Harold followed it as far as he could, tracing its path through the basement and out into the garden. The wire disappeared into the ground about 50 feet from the house, and from there he could only estimate its direction, but the trajectory was clear. It was feeding something beneath that concrete pad. "Margaret," he said that night, his voice tight with something between fear and excitement. "I need to show you something." They walked together through the darkening garden, past the empty pool and the overgrown hedges, until they stood at the edge of the tennis court. The sun had nearly set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The court stretched before them, its faded surface glowing faintly in the dying light. Harold pointed to the concrete pad. "Look at it. Really look." Margaret studied it for a long moment, her brow furrowed. "It's different," she said slowly. "The color, the texture, and it's too big." "There's ventilation," Harold said, "and power lines running underground. Heavy gauge wire, the kind you'd use for industrial equipment or climate control." Margaret's hand found his and squeezed tight. "Harold, what are you saying?" He turned to face her, his weathered face grave in the fading light. "I'm saying there's something beneath this tennis court, something someone went to a lot of trouble to hide, something that needs electricity and air circulation." Margaret's eyes widened. "Like a vault?" "Like a vault." They stood there together as the last light faded from the sky, two elderly Americans in a foreign land holding hands at the edge of a mystery that was about to consume them both. The tennis court lay silent before them, its secrets buried beneath concrete and time. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell began to ring. The sound carried across the hills like a warning, or perhaps an invitation. Harold thought about the documents they had found, the millions moving through hidden accounts, the bankruptcy that somehow never quite accounted for everything. And now this, a structure buried beneath a tennis court, fed by power lines that had no business existing. Boris Becker had hidden more than trophies in this place. Harold was sure of it now. "What do we do?" Margaret whispered. Harold stared at the concrete pad, his electrician's mind already working, already planning, already calculating what it would take to uncover whatever lay beneath. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we start digging." Margaret leaned her head against his shoulder. They had come to this place as refugees, as victims, as people the world had thrown away. They had expected nothing more than shelter from the winter cold. Instead, they had stumbled into a secret that powerful people had spent years trying to bury. And as the stars began to emerge over Mallorca's ancient hills, Harold and Margaret Cole stood at the threshold of a discovery that would change not just their lives, but the lives of thousands of people they had never met. They didn't know it yet, but beneath their feet, buried in the darkness, waited $275 million. And the truth that came with it would shake the foundations of everything they thought they knew about justice, about wealth, and about what happens when ordinary people refuse to look away from extraordinary secrets. The night grew cold around them, but neither moved. They simply stood there, hand in hand, an elderly couple on the edge of something vast and unknowable. Tomorrow would bring answers. Tomorrow would bring danger. Tomorrow would bring a choice that would test every principle they had ever held dear. But tonight, they just held each other and watched the stars wheel overhead and wondered what kind of world buries fortunes beneath tennis courts while honest people sleep in cars. The wind picked up, rustling through the wild olive trees, carrying with it the scent of rosemary and salt and secrets waiting to be told. Harold and Margaret Cole had lost everything once. They had nothing left to lose, and that perhaps made them the most dangerous people in all of Mallorca. Harold didn't sleep that night. He lay beside Margaret in their small borrowed bedroom, staring at the ceiling while moonlight traced patterns across the cracked plaster. His mind wouldn't stop racing, wouldn't stop calculating, wouldn't stop returning to that concrete pad at the edge of the tennis court. 47 years as an electrician had taught him many things: how to read a building's bones through its wiring, how to trace circuits that other people couldn't see, how to recognize when something didn't belong, when a wire ran somewhere it had no business running, when power flowed to places that shouldn't need it. That tennis court was hiding something. He was certain of it now. The heavy-gauge wiring, the ventilation grate, the two new concrete that didn't match the rest of the structure. Someone had built something beneath that surface, something that required electricity and climate control, something worth going to extraordinary lengths to conceal. Beside him, Margaret stirred. "You're still awake," she murmured. "Can't stop thinking about it." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Harold, maybe we should leave it alone. We've been lucky so far. We have shelter, we have food, we have each other. If we start digging into things that don't concern us, it might concern us more than we know," Harold said softly. "Those documents you found, the bank statements showing money moving through offshore accounts. If Boris Becker was hiding assets from his creditors, hiding money that should have gone to people he owed, then that's a matter for lawyers and courts, not for two homeless Americans who are technically trespassing." Harold turned to face her in the darkness. Even after 49 years of marriage, he could read her expressions by feel alone. She was scared, not of the discovery itself, but of what might happen if they pursued it. "Maggie," he said, using the nickname he only used in their most intimate moments. "When that Ponzi scheme took everything from us, do you remember what we said?" She was silent. "We said we wished someone had exposed the truth before it was too late. We said we wished someone had cared enough to dig deeper, to ask questions, to not just accept things at face value." He reached out and took her hand. "Maybe this is our chance to be that someone for other people." Margaret squeezed his fingers. "Or maybe it's our chance to get ourselves killed." "Maybe," Harold admitted. "But I've been dying slowly for 2 years now. Losing our savings, losing our home, sleeping in that car, eating from food banks while watching you cough through the cold nights. If I'm going to die anyway, I'd rather die doing something that matters." The silence stretched between them, heavy with decades of shared history and unspoken fears. Finally, Margaret let out a long breath. "Then we do it together," she said. "Whatever we find, whatever happens, we face it together." Harold kissed her forehead. Together. Always. Morning came grey and cool, the kind of Mallorca winter day that tourists never see in the brochures. Harold was up before dawn, moving through the villa with purpose. He gathered his tools, the modest collection he had salvaged from the garage over the past months. A multimeter for testing electrical connections, wire strippers and crimpers, a set of screwdrivers in various sizes, a flashlight with fresh batteries he had carefully rationed. Margaret made coffee on the small camping stove they used when the ancient kitchen range was being temperamental. She watched her husband pack his tool bag with the methodical precision she had observed for nearly half a century. "Where do you start?" she asked. "The junction box," Harold replied. "Every electrical system has one. If power is running to that tennis court, it has to connect somewhere. I need to find where." He spent the morning in the basement, tracing wires through dusty conduits and along crumbling walls. The villa's electrical system was a patchwork of different eras. Some wiring dated back to the original 1960s construction. Some had been upgraded in the 80s, and some was clearly more recent. It was that recent wiring that interested Harold most. He found what he was looking for behind a false panel near the foundation wall. A junction box, industrial grade, the kind used for heavy machinery or climate control systems. It was newer than everything around it, professionally installed and completely unnecessary for a residential property. Unless that property had something to hide. 4 heavy cables ran from the junction box, disappearing into the concrete foundation. Harold traced their direction with his multimeter, following the electrical signature through the building structure. They all led the same way, toward the rear of the property, toward the tennis court. "Found it," he muttered to himself. He emerged from the basement covered in cobwebs and dust, his joints aching from crawling through tight spaces. Margaret was waiting with a glass of water and a concerned expression. "Well?" "There's definitely power running to something under that court. Serious power. Enough for industrial climate control, maybe lighting, maybe security systems. Whatever's down there, someone wanted it kept at a specific temperature and humidity." Margaret's face paled. "Like a vault for storing valuables?" "Exactly like that." They walked together to the tennis court, the midday sun doing little to warm the chill that had settled over them. Harold circled the perimeter slowly, studying every detail. The court itself was regulation size, about 78 feet long and 36 feet wide. The concrete pad he had noticed the day before sat at the south end, partially concealed by overgrown vegetation. But there was something else he had missed before. Near the edge of the court, almost invisible beneath years of accumulated dirt and fallen leaves, sat a decorative stone bench. It looked like a standard garden fixture, the kind you might find in any Mediterranean estate. But Harold noticed that it was positioned oddly, not facing the court as you would expect, but angled toward the concrete pad. He knelt beside the bench and brushed away the debris. The stone was solid, weathered, unremarkable, but at its base, hidden behind a decorative plaque that read Wimbledon 1985, he found a small metal panel. His heart began to race. The panel was secured with a specialized lock, the kind that required a specific tool to open. Harold had seen locks like this before in high-security industrial installations, but he had also learned over 47 years in the trade that every lock has a weakness. He returned to the villa and spent 2 hours fashioning a makeshift key from a piece of wire coat hanger and a small screwdriver. Margaret watched him work, her anxiety growing with each passing minute. "Harold, what if there are alarms? What if this triggers something?" "The power's been off for years," Harold said, not looking up from his work. "Even if there were alarms once, they're dead now. Besides, I restored electricity to the main house. If anything was going to trigger, it would have happened already." He wasn't entirely sure that was true, but he needed to believe it. By mid-afternoon, he had fashioned something that might work. They returned to the tennis court together, the homemade tool clutched in Harold's trembling hand. "Ready?" he asked. Margaret nodded, her face pale but determined. Harold inserted the makeshift key into the lock panel. He felt for the mechanism inside, using the same instincts that had guided him through thousands of electrical repairs. There was resistance, then a soft click, then another. The panel swung open. Inside was not a lock, but a keypad, digital, with a small screen that flickered to life as the panel opened. Numbers 0 through 9, plus a red button and a green button. "It still has power," Margaret whispered. Harold studied the keypad. The screen displayed a simple prompt. "Enter access code." 6 digits, he said, noting the format. Could be anything. A birthday, an anniversary, a significant date. Margaret's librarian mind was already working. Boris Becker, born November 22, 1967. His most famous win was Wimbledon 1985, when he was just 17. "Try the birthday first," Harold said. Margaret carefully entered 112267. The screen flashed red. Access denied. "Wimbledon year?" Harold suggested. She tried 198507, adding what she guessed was the month of the tournament. Red flash again. Access denied. "Wait," Margaret said suddenly. "The year he won 3 times. He won Wimbledon in 85, 86, and 89. What if—" She entered 858689. The screen flashed green. A deep mechanical hum vibrated through the ground beneath their feet. Harold grabbed Margaret's arm and pulled her back as the concrete pad began to move. It didn't lift like a door. It slid, the entire 12 by 12 section retracting horizontally beneath the adjacent surface of the tennis court. The mechanism was hydraulic, nearly silent, engineered with the precision of something built to last decades. Beneath the sliding panel, a staircase descended into darkness. Harold and Margaret stood frozen, staring at the opening that had appeared in the earth. Cool air rose from below, carrying the faint smell of recycled atmosphere and something else, paper maybe, or old leather. "My God!" Margaret breathed. Harold switched on his flashlight and shone it down the stairs. Concrete steps, at least 20 of them, leading to what appeared to be a landing. The walls were smooth, reinforced professional construction. This wasn't a makeshift hiding spot. This was an engineered facility. "We should go back," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "Call someone. The police, maybe, or a lawyer." Harold shook his head slowly. "If we call the police, they'll ask how we found this. They'll discover we've been living here illegally. We'll be arrested for trespassing, maybe worse. And whoever built this—" He gestured at the stairs descending into darkness. "They have lawyers too, expensive ones, the kind who make problems disappear." "So what do we do?" Harold looked at his wife, at the fear and determination warring in her eyes, at the woman who had stood beside him through 49 years of joy and heartbreak. "We go down," he said. "We see what's there, and then we decide." Together, hand in hand, they descended. What happens next will test everything this couple believes about right and wrong, expose a secret that powerful people buried for years, and remind us that sometimes the poorest among us carry the richest hearts. Stay tuned to see what they decide. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The stairs seemed to go on forever. Harold counted 23 steps before they reached the landing, which turned 90 degrees and continued down another 15. The air grew cooler with each step, temperature controlled exactly as he had suspected. At the bottom they found a door, heavy steel, like something from a bank vault, but it stood slightly ajar, perhaps a quarter-inch of gap between the door and its frame. Harold pushed against it, and it swung inward with surprising ease, perfectly balanced on massive hinges. Beyond the door lay a room that defied everything they had expected. It was large, maybe 40 feet by 60 feet, with ceilings high enough that Harold's flashlight couldn't quite reach them. The walls were lined with what looked like safety deposit boxes, hundreds of them, row upon row stretching into the shadows. In the center of the room sat a massive conference table, surrounded by leather chairs now cracked with age. Filing cabinets lined one wall, and at the far end, another vault door, this one standing wide open. Margaret's hand tightened on Harold's arm. "This isn't just a vault," she whispered. This is a bunker, a command center." Harold swept his flashlight across the space. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, but beneath that dust, the room was immaculate, organized, maintained until the moment it was sealed and forgotten. They moved forward slowly, their footsteps echoing in the underground chamber. Harold paused at the filing cabinets, pulling open a drawer at random. Inside were folders, thick with documents, labeled in German, with dates spanning from 1992 to 2018. "Records," he murmured. "Years of records." Margaret had moved to the safety deposit boxes. She ran her fingers along the numbered plates, stopping at one that had been left slightly open. She pulled it out. Inside were stacks of currency. Euros, bound in plastic wrap, fresh and crisp as the day they were printed. Her hands began to shake. "Harold," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. "Harold, come look at this." He crossed the room and stared at the open box. The euros were bundled in stacks of 10,000 each. He counted quickly, 20 stacks in this box alone. 200,000 euros. And there were hundreds of boxes on the wall. His mind reeled with the mathematics. If even half of these boxes contained similar amounts. The vault, Margaret said, pointing to the open door at the far end of the room. "We need to see what's in there." They crossed the bunker together, stepping over cables and around furniture, their flashlights creating dancing shadows on the walls. The vault door was massive, at least 2 feet thick, its surface marked with the logo of a Swiss security company. It had been left open, perhaps in haste, perhaps deliberately. Inside, Harold and Margaret stopped breathing. The vault was smaller than the outer room, maybe 20 feet square, but every inch of it was filled with wealth beyond their comprehension. Against one wall, shelving units held stacks of cash, not just euros but dollars, Swiss francs, British pounds. Against another wall, small wooden crates sat stacked 4 high, their lids pried open to reveal the unmistakable gleam of gold bars. A third wall held filing cabinets stuffed with documents, and a fourth displayed framed certificates that Harold recognized as bearer bonds, financial instruments worth their face value to whoever held them. In the center of the vault sat a desk, and on that desk lay a leather-bound ledger, open to a page covered in handwritten figures. Margaret approached the desk as if in a trance. She looked down at the ledger, her librarian's eyes scanning the columns of numbers. "Harold," she said, her voice cracking. "These are account summaries, totals from different holdings. This column here," she traced her finger down the page. "It adds up to over 150 million euros, and this one," she flipped to another page, "another 80 million in dollar-denominated assets." Harold picked up a stack of bearer bonds from the cabinet and examined them. Each bond had a face value of 500,000 Swiss francs. There were at least 30 of them visible. 15 million francs, just in what he could see. "This can't be real," he muttered. But it was real. The weight of the gold in his hand when he picked up a bar was real. The crisp texture of the currency was real. The dust settling on his fingers as he touched surfaces that hadn't been disturbed in years was real. They were standing in a vault containing more money than either of them could have earned in 1,000 lifetimes. Margaret collapsed into the chair behind the desk, her face pale, her breath coming in short gasps. 275 million, she whispered, staring at the ledger. "That's what this adds up to. $275 million, give or take, when you convert all the currencies." Harold stood frozen, his mind unable to process the number. 275 million. He had spent his entire career working with his hands, earning modest wages, saving carefully for a retirement that had been stolen from him. And now he was standing in a room that contained more wealth than he could have accumulated in 10,000 years of honest work. "The bankruptcy," Margaret said slowly, her voice hollow. "Boris Becker declared bankruptcy in 2017. He owed creditors over $60 million. His lawyers said he had no assets, that everything was gone, that he couldn't pay." She looked around the vault, at the stacks of cash and gold and bonds. But this was here the whole time. Harold remembered the news stories now. The fallen tennis star, once worth over $130 million, claiming poverty. The court proceedings, the accusations of hidden assets, the eventual prison sentence for concealing wealth from bankruptcy trustees. Becker had served time, over 2 years, for failing to disclose properties and cash. But the prosecutors had only found a fraction of what they suspected was hidden. Now they knew why. "He built this before the bankruptcy," Harold said. "Maybe years before. He knew it was coming. He transferred everything he could into cash, into gold, into untraceable assets, and he buried it here, literally buried it. And then he went to prison rather than reveal where it was. Because this is worth more than 2 years of his life. This is worth more than anything." Margaret stared at the piles of wealth surrounding them. Her face was a mask of conflicting emotions, shock, fear, anger, and something else, something that looked almost like hope. "Harold," she said quietly, "we could take it." He looked at her. "Not all of it, just Enough. Enough to get back on our feet. Enough to rent a real apartment, to see a doctor about your back and my cough, to live out our remaining years with dignity. Tears were streaming down her face now. We lost everything because of someone else's crime. David, with his fake fund and his charming smile, he stole our future. Why shouldn't we take a little of this? Boris Becker stole it from his creditors. We'd just be stealing from a thief. Harold sat down on a crate of gold bars, the weight of the decision pressing on his shoulders. She wasn't wrong. Nothing she said was wrong. They had been victims. They had been honest their entire lives, and honesty had brought them nothing but suffering. The money sitting in this vault would never be missed. It wasn't supposed to exist in the first place. And yet, Maggie, he said softly, when we lost our savings, when that Ponzi scheme collapsed, what hurt the most? She was quiet for a moment. Losing the house, losing our future. But what hurt the most emotionally? What kept you up at night? Margaret's tears fell faster now. The betrayal, she whispered, trusting someone who turned out to be a lie. Harold nodded. That's what this money represents too. Boris Becker owed $60 million to creditors, real people. Maybe some of them were banks, but some of them were contractors who built his houses, staff who worked for his companies, investors who believed his promises. He gestured at the vault around them. Every euro in this room is money that should have gone to them, to people who trusted and were betrayed, just like us. Margaret buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. If we take this money, Harold continued, we become David. We become the people who profit from other people's suffering. And we spend whatever years we have left knowing that we're no different from the man who destroyed us. So what do we do? Margaret asked, her voice muffled by her hands. Report it to the police and go to jail for trespassing? Hand it over to lawyers who'll probably steal half of it themselves? I don't know, Harold admitted. But I know what we don't do. We don't become thieves. We don't abandon who we are. They sat in silence for a long time, surrounded by more wealth than most people could imagine. Two elderly Americans at the end of their road, facing a choice that would define whatever remained of their lives. Finally, Margaret lifted her head. Her eyes were red, but something had shifted in her expression. The desperation had been replaced by something harder, more resolute. Then we find another way, she said. We find a way to get this money to the people it belongs to, the creditors, the victims, whoever they are. And we do it without anyone knowing we were ever here. Harold looked at his wife with the same admiration he had felt on their wedding day, 49 years ago. She was still the strongest person he had ever known. How? He asked. Margaret's jaw tightened. I was a librarian for 35 years. I know how to research, how to find information, how to connect dots that other people miss. And you were an electrician who could trace any wire to its source. She stood up, squaring her shoulders. Boris Becker didn't hide this money alone. There are records here, documents, account numbers. Somewhere in all of this is a trail that leads to the people who helped him and to the people he stole from. And when we find that trail, then we make sure the right people follow it. They spent another hour in the vault, not touching anything, just documenting. Harold had his phone, ancient, cracked, but still functional, and he photographed everything. The stacks of cash, the gold bars, the bearer bonds, the filing cabinets full of records. Margaret took notes, cataloguing what she could see, creating an inventory of stolen wealth that would serve as proof. When they finally climbed back up the stairs, the afternoon sun was beginning to fade. Harold found the control panel and pressed the button to close the hydraulic cover. The concrete slid back into place with barely a whisper, sealing the vault beneath the tennis court once more. They stood in the dying light, two people changed forever by what they had seen. We can never tell anyone we were down there, Margaret said quietly. If the wrong people find out we know about this. Harold nodded. He understood. This wasn't just about hidden money anymore. This was about powerful people with secrets worth killing to protect. We need to be careful, he agreed. Whoever helped Becker hide this, they're still out there. Lawyers, bankers, fixers, the kind of people who make problems disappear. Margaret shivered, and not from the cold. Then we're agreed. We keep this to ourselves until we figure out a way to expose it safely. Agreed. They walked back to the villa as the stars began to emerge, their hands clasped together, their steps slow and heavy. The weight of what they carried wasn't measured in gold or currency. It was measured in responsibility, in the burden of knowing a truth that could change thousands of lives. That night, they lay in their borrowed bed, neither of them able to sleep. Harold stared at the ceiling, his mind churning through the implications of what they had discovered. $275 million, hidden by a fallen sports star, sitting beneath a tennis court on property they had stumbled into by chance. It felt like fate, it felt like curse, it felt like both at once. "Harold," Margaret whispered in the darkness. "Yes?" "Do you think we were meant to find it? All the things that happened to us, losing our money, becoming homeless, ending up in this exact place at this exact time. Do you think there's a reason?" Harold considered the question. He had never been a religious man, not really, but he had always believed in something larger than himself. Call it fate, call it providence, call it the universe balancing its books. "I think," he said slowly, "that sometimes the world puts people in positions they never expected, and what matters isn't why you ended up there. It's what you do once you arrive." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she rolled over and pressed herself against his side, her head on his shoulder. "Whatever happens," she murmured, "we do it together." "Together," Harold agreed. "Always." Outside, the wind rustled through the wild olive trees, carrying with it the scent of the sea and the weight of secrets waiting to be revealed. Somewhere beneath the abandoned tennis court, $275 million sat in darkness, patient and silent, waiting to be returned to the light. Harold and Margaret Cole had spent their whole lives being ordinary people. Hard-working, honest, invisible to a world that valued flash-over substance. But ordinary people, they were beginning to understand, sometimes found themselves at the center of extraordinary circumstances. And what they did next would determine not just their own futures, but the futures of thousands of people they had never met, victims of a famous man's greed, waiting for justice they had been told would never come. The villa creaked and settled around them, its ancient stones holding secrets of their own. And in the distance, barely audible over the wind, the church bells of Palma began to ring, marking the passage of another hour in a night that felt endless. Harold closed his eyes, but sleep remained far away. His mind was already working, already planning, already searching for the path that would lead them out of this maze of wealth and deception. They had found the vault. They had seen the fortune. Now they had to figure out how to set it free without destroying themselves in the process. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Harold couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer alone, that eyes were watching from the shadows, that the discovery of this vault had set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. The game had begun, and Harold and Margaret Cole, two homeless elderly Americans with nothing left to lose, were about to become the most unlikely players in it. The days that followed were the longest of Harold's life. He moved through the villa like a ghost, going through the motions of their daily routine while his mind remained trapped beneath the tennis court, surrounded by stacks of currency and gold bars that glowed in his memory like fever dreams. Margaret was no better. She barely ate. She spoke in fragments, her sentences trailing off into silence as her thoughts pulled her back to that underground vault. At night, they lay beside each other in the darkness, both awake, both pretending to sleep, both wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. "We could leave," Harold said one morning, breaking a silence that had stretched through breakfast. "Pack what little we have, get in the car, drive away. Pretend we never found it." Margaret set down her coffee cup. "And spend the rest of our lives knowing what we left behind. Knowing that money sits there while the people it was stolen from struggle just like we did. At least we'd be safe. Would we?" Margaret's eyes were hollow, ringed with shadows from sleepless nights. "I close my eyes, and all I see is that vault. All that wealth, hidden away while honest people lost everything. How do we walk away from that?" Harold had no answer. They had photographed everything during their time in the vault, over 300 images captured on Harold's ancient phone. Margaret had spent hours organizing them, creating a digital record of what they had witnessed. But having evidence was one thing, knowing what to do with it was another entirely. "We could go to the police," Margaret suggested one afternoon, though her voice carried no conviction. Harold shook his head. "And tell them what? That we've been living illegally in a mansion owned by creditors and bankruptcy trustees? That we broke into a hidden vault beneath the property? Best case, they arrest us for trespassing and theft. Worst case, whoever helped Becker hide that money has connections in law enforcement. We report it and we disappear." Then lawyers, bankruptcy attorneys who handled his case. "Same problem. We don't know who's clean and who's compromised. Becker didn't hide $275 million by himself. He had help, bankers, lawyers, accountants, people with power and connections who made sure that money stayed hidden. If we approach the wrong person..." Margaret buried her face in her hands. "So we just do nothing. We let it sit there while victims wait for justice that never comes." The frustration in her voice matched the churning in Harold's gut. They had spent their whole lives being good people, following rules, trusting systems, and those systems had failed them completely. The financial regulators who should have caught the Ponzi scheme that destroyed them, the banks that should have flagged suspicious transactions, the lawyers and courts that should have protected ordinary investors from predators. Now they had stumbled onto evidence of another massive fraud, and the same systems they had trusted stood between them and doing the right thing. That night, Harold couldn't stay inside. He walked the grounds of the villa, breathing the cool Mediterranean air, trying to clear his head. The garden was wild and overgrown, but beautiful in its chaos. Bougainvillea cascading over stone walls, jasmine perfuming the darkness, olive trees twisted with age standing like ancient sentinels. He found himself at the edge of the tennis court, staring at the concrete pad that concealed so much. The surface looked ordinary now, just weathered cement cracked with age. But he knew what lay beneath. He could feel it, like a weight pressing up through the earth. $275 million. The number was almost incomprehensible. He tried to break it down into terms he could understand. $420,000. That's what he and Margaret had lost in the Ponzi scheme. Their entire life savings wiped out. At that rate, the vault beneath his feet contained enough money for over 650 families to retire comfortably. 650 families. People with names and faces and dreams just like him and Margaret. People who had worked their whole lives, saved carefully, trusted the wrong person, and lost everything. Boris Becker had owed money to creditors after his bankruptcy. Real people and institutions who had extended credit, provided services, made investments based on his promises. When he declared bankruptcy, claiming he couldn't pay, many of those creditors had received only pennies on the dollar, or nothing at all. But the money existed. It had always existed. Becker had simply chosen to hide it rather than honor his obligations. Harold felt something hot rise in his chest. Anger. The same anger he had felt when David, the man in the linen suit, had vanished with their savings. the same anger that had burned in him during those nights sleeping in the car, watching Margaret shiver under thin blankets. Fraud was fraud, theft was theft, and the victims deserved better. He walked back to the villa with new resolve. "We need to research this," he told Margaret. "Everything about Becker's bankruptcy, his case, who he owed money to. If we're going to expose this, we need to understand who the victims are and how to reach them." Margaret looked up from the book she hadn't been reading. Something in her expression shifted, the despair giving way to purpose. "The library in Palma," she said slowly. "They have public computers with internet access. I could spend a few hours there digging through news archives and court records, and I'll keep working on the villa's systems. If anyone's been monitoring this place remotely, there might be evidence in the electrical infrastructure. Hidden cameras, alarm systems, communication lines. For the first time in days, they had a plan. It wasn't much, but it was something. And sometimes something was all you needed to keep moving forward. Margaret spent 3 days at the Palmer Public Library, hunched over a computer terminal in the corner, scrolling through years of news articles and legal documents. What she found painted a picture of a man who had risen to the heights of athletic fame and then fallen spectacularly into disgrace. Boris Becker had burst onto the world tennis scene in 1985, winning Wimbledon at just 17 years old. He went on to win 5 more Grand Slam titles, earn tens of millions in prize money and endorsements, and become one of the most recognizable athletes on the planet. At his peak, his net worth was estimated at over $130 million. But the money flowed out as fast as it came in. Expensive divorces, bad investments, lavish spending, and a lifestyle that matched his celebrity status drained his fortune. By the mid-2000s, Becker was struggling financially. By 2017, he declared bankruptcy in the United Kingdom, claiming he could not pay debts totaling over $60 million. The bankruptcy proceedings revealed a tangled web of hidden assets. Properties in Spain, Germany, and the Caribbean, bank accounts in Switzerland and Liechtenstein, artwork, jewelry, and luxury items that Becker had failed to disclose to trustees. Prosecutors alleged that he had deliberately concealed millions in assets to avoid paying creditors. In 2022, Becker was convicted of 4 charges related to his bankruptcy. He served 8 months of a 2.5-year sentence before being released and deported to Germany. Throughout the proceedings, authorities suspected that significant assets remained hidden, but they could never locate them. Margaret printed everything she could find: articles, court documents, lists of creditors, statements from the bankruptcy trustees expressing frustration at Becker's lack of cooperation. When she spread the papers across the villa's dining table, the scope of the fraud became painfully clear. Among the creditors listed were banks and financial institutions, yes, but also smaller victims. A contractor who had renovated one of Becker's properties and never been fully paid. A former business partner who had invested £600,000 in a venture that collapsed. A pension fund that had extended credit based on Becker's supposed wealth. Even former household staff who were owed back wages. "Look at this," Margaret said, pointing to one document. "There's a charity listed here. They donated services and facilities for a tennis academy Becker was supposed to fund. When he went bankrupt, they lost over €200,000. Harold studied the paper. A charity, stealing from a charity. And here, a family in Munich. They loaned him money based on a handshake and a promise. €300,000. They lost their retirement savings when he couldn't pay them back." Harold felt sick. These weren't abstract numbers anymore. These were people, ordinary people who had trusted a famous name and paid the price. "We have to do something," Margaret said quietly. "We can't just leave this." "I know," Harold agreed. "But what? We're nobodies, 2 homeless Americans who stumbled onto this by accident. Who would even believe us?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she pulled out another piece of paper, a printout she had made that afternoon. "Maybe her," she said. The paper showed a photograph of a young woman, perhaps early 30s, with dark curly hair and intense eyes. The caption identified her as Sofia Delgado, investigative journalist for El Periódico de Mallorca. "I found several articles," she wrote, Margaret explained. "Over the past 3 years, she's been tracking the Becker bankruptcy case, writing about hidden assets, interviewing creditors who never got paid. She believes there's still money out there, and she's been trying to prove it." Harold studied the photograph. "You think she's trustworthy?" "I think she's been looking for what we found, and I think she might be the only person who would believe us without turning us over to people who want this buried." It was a risk, a massive risk. They had no way of knowing if this journalist was legitimate, if she could be trusted, if approaching her would expose them to the very danger they were trying to avoid. But they were running out of options. "How do we contact her?" Harold asked. Margaret pulled out a small slip of paper. "Her email is listed at the bottom of her articles. I could write to her, explain what we found, see if she's willing to meet." Harold took a deep breath. Once they sent that email, there was no going back. They would be committed to a path that could lead anywhere, to justice, to exposure, to danger they couldn't predict. "Do it," he said finally. "But be careful. Don't mention the villa's location. Don't give any details that could identify us until we know we can trust her." Margaret nodded. That night she composed a careful message. "Dear Miss Delgado, my name is not important right now. I am writing because I have information about assets hidden by Boris Becker that have never been recovered. I have seen them with my own eyes. I have photographs and documentation. I believe this evidence could help the creditors who were defrauded during his bankruptcy. I am not looking for money. I am looking for someone I can trust to do the right thing with this information. If you are interested in meeting, please respond to this address and suggest a public location. Sincerely, a concerned citizen." She sent the message and then sat back, her heart pounding. The response came faster than either of them expected. The next morning, Margaret's ancient phone buzzed with a notification. An email from Sofia Delgado. "Your message is intriguing, but I have received many such claims over the years. Most turn out to be hoaxes or people seeking attention. If you truly have evidence of hidden Becker assets, I will need more than your word. Can you provide any proof before we meet? A photograph, a document, anything that suggests this is real?" Margaret showed the message to Harold. They debated for nearly an hour before deciding to send one photograph, a single image showing stacks of euro currency beside a gold bar, the corner of the leather-bound ledger visible in the frame. Enough to prove they weren't fabricating their claims, not enough to reveal the location. The response came within minutes. "Where and when can we meet?" They agreed on a cafe in Palmer's Old Town, a public place with plenty of witnesses. Margaret specified that Sophia should come alone and that Harold would be watching from a distance for their protection. Sophia agreed without argument. The meeting took place 3 days later, on a grey morning when clouds hung low over the city and the streets smelled of rain. Margaret sat at a corner table, her coffee untouched, watching the door. Harold was across the street, pretending to read a newspaper at an outdoor table, his eyes never leaving the cafe's entrance. Sofia Delgado arrived exactly on time. She was smaller than Margaret had expected from the photographs, but her presence was larger. There was an intensity to her movements, a sharpness to her gaze that suggested someone who had spent years chasing difficult truths. She spotted Margaret immediately, the only elderly woman sitting alone with a manila envelope on the table, and crossed the room without hesitation. "You're the one who emailed." Her English was accented but fluent. Margaret nodded. "Please, sit down." Sophia slid into the chair across from her, her eyes dropping to the envelope. "That photograph you sent. I've seen a lot of fakes in my career. That one didn't look fake." "It's not. Then I need to understand what I'm dealing with. Who are you? How did you find this? Margaret took a deep breath, and then, carefully, leaving out the villa's exact location, she told the story. The financial ruin that had brought them to Mallorca, the desperate months living in their car, the abandoned property they had stumbled upon and cautiously claimed as shelter, the discovery of the documents, the hidden entrance beneath the tennis court, the vault filled with wealth beyond imagination. Sophia listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When Margaret finished, the journalist was silent for a long moment. 275 million, she repeated slowly. That's what the ledger tallied. Cash, gold, bearer bonds, all hidden away while his creditors received nothing. Sophia leaned back in her chair, her eyes distant. I've been investigating this case for 3 years. I always believed there was more. The numbers never added up. Prosecutors found some hidden assets, but nowhere near enough to explain where all the money went. She focused on Margaret again. And you've seen it? You've been inside? We have photographs, hundreds of them, documents too, bank statements, account records, transfer logs. Why didn't you take anything? You're homeless, you said. That money could have changed your lives. Margaret met her gaze steadily. It's not ours to take. We lost everything to a swindler who stole from people who trusted him. We know what that feels like. We couldn't become the same kind of people, no matter how desperate we were. Something shifted in Sophia's expression. The professional skepticism gave way to something warmer. Respect, perhaps, or understanding. You realize what you're sitting on, Sophia said quietly. This isn't just about one man hiding money. There are networks involved. Lawyers, bankers, fixers who specialize in making assets disappear. Some of them have connections to organized crime. If they find out you've discovered this, we know, Margaret said. That's why we came to you. We need help exposing this in a way that protects us and gets justice for the victims. Sophia was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small digital recorder. I want to see it, she said. The vault, the documents, everything. If this is what you say it is, I can help you. I have contacts, prosecutors, financial investigators, journalists at larger publications who can give this international coverage, but I need to verify it with my own eyes first. Margaret looked across the street to where Harold sat watching. She raised her hand slightly, a prearranged signal. He stood up, folded his newspaper, and began walking toward the cafe. My husband will take you to see it, Margaret said. But if you betray us, if this turns out to be a trap— It's not, Sophia said firmly. I've spent 3 years trying to find the truth about where Becker's money went. If you found it, I'm not going to let anyone bury it again. Harold entered the cafe and crossed to their table. Sophia stood to greet him, extending her hand. Mr. Harold, he said simply. Just Harold. Sophia, I understand you're going to show me something remarkable. Harold exchanged a glance with Margaret. After 49 years of marriage, they could communicate volumes in a single look. Follow me, Harold said, and keep your eyes open. If anyone is watching, we need to know. The drive to the villa took nearly an hour, with Harold taking a deliberately circuitous route to ensure they weren't being followed. Sophia sat in the back seat, her recorder running, asking quiet questions about how they had traced the electrical systems to the hidden vault. When they finally turned onto the winding road that led to the estate, Sophia leaned forward, her breath catching at the sight of the massive property. This is Becker's villa, she murmured. I knew it existed, but I was told it was under dispute in bankruptcy proceedings. The trustees couldn't access it because of legal challenges. Convenient, Harold said dryly. They parked near the garage and walked through the overgrown gardens toward the tennis court. The sky had cleared somewhat, pale sunlight breaking through the clouds and casting long shadows across the neglected grounds. Harold led the way to the stone bench, knelt down, and accessed the concealed control panel. When the keypad appeared, he entered the code, the same sequence of Wimbledon victory years that Margaret had guessed. 858689. The hydraulic system engaged. The concrete pad slid away, revealing the stairs descending into darkness. Sophia stood frozen, staring at the opening in the earth. "Madre de Dios," she whispered. They descended together, Harold leading with his flashlight, Sophia following with her phone's camera already recording. The cool, climate-controlled air rose to meet them, carrying that same scent of recycled atmosphere and preserved wealth. When they reached the main chamber, Sophia stopped breathing. She swept her phone across the space, capturing the rows of safety deposit boxes, the filing cabinets, the leather chairs around the conference table. Then they moved to the vault itself, and her knees actually buckled when she saw what was inside. "This is real," she breathed, reaching out to touch a stack of euros before pulling her hand back. "This is all real." "We told you," Margaret said softly. Sophia spent nearly 2 hours in the vault, documenting everything. She photographed the currency stacks, the gold bars, the bearer bonds. She recorded the contents of filing cabinet drawers, reading account numbers and transfer dates into her microphone. She examined the leather-bound ledger with the intensity of a scholar discovering a lost manuscript. When she finally emerged from the underground chamber, her face was pale, but her eyes were blazing. "Do you understand what this means?" she said. "This is evidence of one of the largest asset-hiding schemes in European sports history. These documents show money flowing through accounts in Switzerland, Liechtenstein, the Cayman Islands, even Singapore. There are records here that prosecutors have been trying to find for years." "And the creditors?" Margaret asked. "The people who were owed money? If this can be recovered, and with this evidence it can be, there would be enough to satisfy every outstanding claim from the bankruptcy. Pensioners who lost their retirement funds, businesses that went under because of unpaid invoices, charities that were promised support and received nothing." Sophia shook her head in disbelief. "You found the missing piece. You found where he hid it all." Harold felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For days he had carried the burden of this secret alone with Margaret, uncertain if exposing it would make any difference. Now, seeing Sophia's reaction, he allowed himself to hope, but the journalist's next words brought him back to earth. "There's going to be danger," Sophia said gravely. "When I publish this, people will come looking. Not just prosecutors, they'll come eventually, and legally. I'm talking about the people who helped Becker hide this money. Lawyers and fixers who took fees for their silence. Some of them have connections that make me very nervous." "We've thought about that," Margaret said. "Have you thought about what happens when this story breaks? Your faces will be everywhere. People will know who you are, where you've been living, how you found this. You'll become targets." Harold and Margaret exchanged another look. "We've been targets before," Harold said quietly. "When we lost everything, when we were sleeping in our car and wondering if we'd survive the night, we were targets then too. Targets of indifference, of a system that doesn't care about ordinary people. At least this time," Margaret added, "we'll be targets for doing the right thing." Sophia studied them for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I'll need to move fast. Once I start making inquiries, word will spread. We probably have days before someone figures out what's happening." She paused. "I want to do a full video interview with you, on camera, telling your story, how you found this place, what you discovered, why you decided to come forward. It will protect you. Once your public face is attached to this story, making you disappear becomes much harder." Margaret's hand found Harold's. "When?" "Tomorrow," Sophia said. "Can you be ready by tomorrow?" Harold took a deep breath. After 73 years of living quietly, of keeping his head down and doing his job and trusting that the world would be fair if he just worked hard enough, after all of that, He was about to step into a spotlight he had never sought. But some things mattered more than safety. Some things mattered more than comfort. Some things mattered more than the quiet life he had always imagined for his final years. "We'll be ready," he said. That night, as they prepared to sleep in the villa for what might be one of the last times, Harold noticed something that made his blood run cold. A car was parked at the end of the long driveway, black, sleek, with tinted windows that reflected the moonlight like dark mirrors. It hadn't been there before. "Maggie," he whispered, "come look at this." Margaret joined him at the window. Her face went pale when she saw the car. "How long has it been there?" "I don't know. I just noticed it." As they watched, the car's headlights flicked on for a brief moment, just long enough to illuminate the villa's facade, then went dark again. A message. Someone wanted them to know they were being watched. Margaret's hand trembled in his. They know. Somehow, they already know. Harold's mind raced through possibilities. Had Sophia betrayed them? Had someone followed them from Palma? Had there been surveillance in the vault that they had missed? "We can't stay here," he said. "We need to leave, now." "And go where? We have nothing. We have no one." "Sophia, she said she had contacts, people who could help." Margaret was already moving, grabbing the few possessions they had accumulated during their months in the villa. Clothing, documents, the photographs on Harold's phone. Within 10 minutes, they were ready. Harold took one last look at the bedroom that had sheltered them through the long winter. It wasn't theirs. It had never been theirs. But for a few months, it had been home. "Let's go," Margaret said softly. They slipped out through the service entrance, the same door they had used when they first arrived. Harold guided their old Volkswagen down a back path he had discovered during his explorations of the property, a service road that wound through the olive groves and emerged on a different highway. The black car never followed. Perhaps its occupants hadn't expected them to run. Perhaps they were waiting for reinforcements. Perhaps it was all a bluff designed to frighten them into silence. It didn't matter. They drove through the night, putting miles between themselves and the villa, heading toward Palma and the only ally they had. Sophia met them at a small hotel near the port, a place where cash transactions raised no eyebrows and questions were not asked. She took one look at their faces and understood. "They found you," she said. "There was a car, watching the villa." Sophia nodded grimly. "Then we move up the timeline. We do the interview tonight. We publish tomorrow. Once this story is out, hiding you becomes pointless." The next 6 hours were a blur. Sophia set up her camera in the cramped hotel room, adjusting lights and sound equipment with professional efficiency. Harold and Margaret sat side by side on the edge of the bed, holding hands, facing the lens that would carry their story to the world. "Tell me everything," Sophia said, "from the beginning." And they did. They talked about their life in Arizona, their dream of retirement in Spain, the Ponzi scheme that destroyed them. They talked about the months of homelessness, the shame and desperation, the cold nights in their car. They talked about finding the villa, about the gradual discovery of its secrets, about the vault beneath the tennis court and the fortune it contained. Margaret cried when she described the moment they realized they could take the money and didn't. Harold's voice cracked when he talked about all the victims, the families and businesses and charities that had been defrauded. "We could have walked away," Margaret said into the camera. "We could have taken enough to survive and disappeared. But that money wasn't ours. It belonged to people who had trusted and been betrayed, just like us, and we couldn't become the thing we hated." When the interview was over, Sophia sat back and let out a long breath. "This is going to change everything," she said. "For you, for the creditors, for everyone involved in hiding that money. Are you sure you're ready?" Harold looked at Margaret. Her eyes were red from crying, her face lined with exhaustion, but beneath all of that was something he had always loved about her, an unshakable core of integrity that no amount of suffering could break. "We're ready," he said. Sophia nodded. Then let's bring this into the light. She began uploading the footage, preparing her article, reaching out to contacts at larger publications who could amplify the story. Within hours, it would be everywhere, and somewhere in the darkness, powerful people would realize that their secrets were about to be exposed by the two most unlikely whistleblowers imaginable, an elderly electrician and a retired librarian who had lost everything except their souls. The game was about to change, and Harold and Margaret Cole were ready to play their part. The story broke at 6:07 in the morning, Spanish time. Sophia had timed it deliberately, early enough to catch the morning news cycle, late enough that the evidence had been verified by her editors and legal team. The headline blazed across El Periódico de Mallorca's website in bold red letters. Elderly American couple discovers €275 million hidden in Boris Becker's abandoned villa. Within an hour, the story had been picked up by Reuters. Within 2 hours, it was trending on every major social media platform in Europe. By noon, camera crews from Germany, Britain, France, and the United States were chartering flights to Mallorca. Harold and Margaret watched it unfold from the small hotel room near the port, their faces illuminated by the glow of Sophia's laptop screen. The interview they had given just hours before was everywhere now. Their weathered faces, their trembling voices, their story of loss and discovery playing on loop across a dozen different news channels. "This is insane," Margaret whispered, watching a German broadcaster analyze the implications of their discovery. "We're on television, in Germany." Harold couldn't speak. He was watching a Spanish news anchor describe them as heroes, ordinary people who had chosen integrity over wealth. It felt surreal, like watching a story about strangers who happened to share their names. Sophia's phone hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn. Calls from prosecutors, from bankruptcy trustees, from journalists at publications around the world. She fielded them with professional calm, but Harold could see the excitement burning in her eyes. "The Spanish National Police want to meet with you," she said, covering the phone's microphone. "They're sending a detective to take your statements, and the UK Bankruptcy Court has already issued an emergency order to secure the villa." "Are we in trouble?" Margaret asked. Sophia shook her head. "You're witnesses, not suspects. You discovered evidence of a crime and reported it. That makes you protected, not prosecuted." She paused. "But they will have questions. A lot of questions." The detective arrived at noon, a woman in her 50s named Inspector Elena Vega, with short grey hair and eyes that had seen too much to be easily impressed. She listened to their story without interruption, taking notes in a small leather-bound book, her expression unreadable. When they finished, she was silent for a long moment. "You lived in that villa for months," she said finally. "You found a fortune that most people couldn't imagine, and you chose to report it instead of taking it." "Yes," Harold said simply. "Why?" Harold looked at Margaret. After 49 years, he didn't need words to know what she was thinking. "Because it wasn't ours," he said, "and because we know what it feels like to lose everything to someone else's greed. We couldn't do that to other people." Inspector Vega studied them for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I've been in law enforcement for 32 years, she said. "I've seen a lot of people make a lot of choices when money is involved. Most of them choose poorly." She closed her notebook. "You two are different, and I want you to know that what you've done, it matters. There are families who will get their money back because of you, businesses that might survive, a charity that can continue its work." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "That's all we wanted. That's all we ever wanted." The inspector stood to leave, then paused at the door. "The investigation will take time, months probably. There will be court proceedings, depositions, testimony. Your lives are about to become very complicated." "They've been complicated for a while," Harold said dryly. Vega almost smiled. "I suppose they have. But this time the complication comes with protection. We'll make sure you're safe." The seizure of the villa happened that afternoon. Harold and Margaret watched from a distance. Sophia had arranged for them to observe from a nearby hillside, as police vehicles and forensic vans converged on the property they had called home for nearly a year. Officers in tactical gear secured the perimeter. Technicians in white suits entered the house, emerging hours later with boxes of documents and evidence bags. And when the hydraulic panel beneath the tennis court slid open and the authorities descended into the vault, Harold felt something release in his chest that he hadn't even known he was holding. It was over. The secret was no longer theirs to carry. "How do you feel?" Sophia asked, her camera capturing their reactions. Margaret wiped her eyes. "Relieved and sad. That place saved our lives, even if we were never supposed to be there." "It was shelter when we had nothing," Harold added. "And now it's evidence. Strange how things work out." The forensic accountants worked through the night. By morning, they had confirmed what Harold and Margaret already knew. The vault contained $275 million in hidden assets, cash in multiple currencies totaling over $140 million, gold bars worth another $63 million, bearer bonds, artwork, jewelry, and other valuables making up the rest. It was the largest recovery of hidden assets in European bankruptcy history. The news exploded across international media. Boris Becker's name was everywhere, not as a tennis legend, but as a fraud who had hidden a fortune while claiming poverty. Legal analysts debated the implications. Financial experts discussed how such a scheme could have remained hidden for so long. And everywhere people talked about Harold and Margaret Cole, the elderly American couple who had stumbled onto a secret and chosen to do the right thing. The first letters arrived 3 days after the story broke. They came to Sophia's office, addressed simply to the American couple, or the people who found the money. Some were from Spain, others from Germany, Britain, countries Harold had never visited. They were from the creditors. The first one Margaret opened was from a woman named Ingrid in Munich. Her family had loaned Boris Becker €300,000 based on a personal guarantee. When he declared bankruptcy, they lost everything. "Dear strangers," the letter read, "I am writing to thank you for something I never thought possible. For 6 years my family has lived with the shame of our loss. My husband blamed himself for trusting someone famous. My children had to drop out of university because we could no longer afford tuition. We lost our home, our savings, our dignity. When I saw your interview, I cried for 3 hours, not from sadness, but from relief. You did what no one else would do. You told the truth when you could have taken the money and disappeared. I don't know if we will ever receive what we are owed, but knowing that justice is possible, knowing that someone cared enough to fight for it, that alone has given us hope. Thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you." Margaret couldn't finish reading aloud. Harold took the letter from her trembling hands and held her while she sobbed. More letters came, dozens, then hundreds. A contractor who had renovated one of Becker's properties and been stiffed for over €200,000. A charity that had planned a tennis academy for underprivileged children and lost their funding when Becker's promises evaporated. A pension fund manager who had extended credit and watched helplessly as retirees' benefits were cut. Each letter told a story of loss, of betrayal, of years spent wondering if justice would ever come. And each letter ended the same way, with gratitude for 2 strangers who had chosen integrity over wealth. "We didn't do this for thanks," Harold said one evening, overwhelmed by the stack of correspondence. "I know," Sophia replied, "but that's exactly why the thanks matter so much. You did it because it was right, not because you expected anything in return. That's what makes you different from everyone else in this story." The legal proceedings moved faster than anyone expected. Spanish authorities coordinated with prosecutors in Germany and the United Kingdom. Bankruptcy trustees filed emergency motions to claim the recovered assets. And within 2 weeks, the first distributions to creditors were announced. The amounts were significant. Families who had lost their retirement savings would receive full compensation. Businesses that had gone under would have their debts settled. The charity for underprivileged tennis players would receive not only what they were owed, but an additional grant from the Spanish government to continue their work. In total, over 4,000 creditors would benefit from the recovery. Some would receive thousands of euros, others hundreds of thousands. But for all of them, the money represented something more than financial compensation. It represented justice. It represented proof that sometimes, against all odds, the truth comes out. Harold and Margaret were called to testify at a preliminary hearing in Palma, their first official appearance before a court. They sat in a wood-panelled chamber, surrounded by lawyers and officials, facing a panel of 3 judges who would determine the next steps in the case. The lead prosecutor, a stern woman named Carmen Ortiz, walked them through their discovery step by step. How they had found the villa, how they had traced the electrical systems, how they had uncovered the hidden entrance and descended into the vault. "And when you saw the money," Prosecutor Ortiz asked, "when you realized the magnitude of what you had found, what was your first thought?" Harold glanced at Margaret. "Honestly, my first thought was that we could take it, that no one would ever know, that after everything we'd been through, maybe we deserved a break." The courtroom was silent. "But then I looked at my wife," Harold continued, his voice steady, "and I remembered who we are. We're not thieves. We're not the kind of people who profit from other people's suffering. We lost everything to someone who was, and we swore we would never become that." Prosecutor Ortiz nodded slowly. "Your testimony will be crucial to the ongoing investigation. We may need you to appear again as the case progresses." "Whatever you need," Margaret said. "We're not going anywhere." As they left the courthouse, they were mobbed by reporters. Cameras flashed. Microphones were thrust toward their faces. Questions came from every direction, overlapping and incomprehensible. Sophia's team formed a protective barrier around them, guiding them to a waiting car. But before they reached it, Harold stopped. "One question," he said, holding up his hand. The crowd fell silent. A young reporter pushed forward. "Mr. Cole, what would you say to people who think you should have kept the money, who say you were foolish to give up a fortune?" Harold considered the question. Then he smiled, a tired smile but genuine. "I'd say they don't understand what wealth really is. Money can buy comfort, it can buy security, but it can't buy the ability to look at yourself in the mirror and know you did the right thing." He put his arm around Margaret. "We've been rich in ways that matter our whole lives. This didn't change that. It just proved it." They climbed into the car and drove away, leaving the cameras and questions behind. The Spanish government's response to the case was unprecedented. Within a month of the discovery, officials announced a special recognition for Harold and Margaret Cole, not just for reporting the hidden assets, but for demonstrating what they called extraordinary civic virtue in the face of personal hardship. The package included a fully furnished apartment in a quiet neighborhood of Palma, with a view of the harbor and enough space for them to live comfortably. It included a modest pension, enough to cover their basic needs without luxury, but without want. And it included something even more valuable, official residency status that would allow them to remain in Spain for as long as they wished. "You're being honored by the king," Sophia told them, her voice incredulous. "There's going to be a ceremony at the Royal Palace in Madrid. You're receiving the Order of Civil Merit." Margaret sat down heavily. "The King of Spain." "The King of Spain!" Harold laughed. A genuine laugh, the kind that came from deep in his belly. "Well, that's something I never expected to put on my resume." The ceremony took place on a crisp autumn morning, in a gilded chamber that made Harold feel like he had stepped into a history book. They wore borrowed formal clothes. Harold in a suit that fit better than anything he had owned in years, Margaret in a simple navy dress that brought out the silver in her hair. King Felipe V spoke briefly about their courage, their integrity, their example for citizens everywhere. He pinned medals to their chests and shook their hands, and Harold felt Margaret trembling beside him. Afterward, at a reception filled with diplomats and dignitaries, an elderly Spanish woman approached them. She introduced herself as the widow of a businessman who had been owed nearly €500,000 from Becker's bankruptcy. "My husband died 3 years ago," she said, her eyes glistening. "He never recovered from the loss, not financially. We managed somehow, but emotionally. He blamed himself for trusting someone who turned out to be a fraud." She took Margaret's hands in hers. "He always said that someday the truth would come out, that justice would find a way. I wish he could have lived to see this day." She pressed a kiss to Margaret's cheek. "Thank you for proving him right." The family reconnection happened gradually, in fits and starts. Their son Thomas called first. He lived in Phoenix now, divorced, working long hours at a job he didn't love to pay off debts from a marriage that had crumbled. Harold hadn't spoken to him in almost 2 years, not from anger, but from shame. He couldn't bear for his children to see what he and Margaret had become. "Dad," Thomas said, his voice cracking over the phone, "I saw the news. I can't believe. Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you let us help?" Harold closed his eyes. "Because you had your own problems. Because we didn't want to be burdens. Because—" He trailed off, unable to finish. "Because you were too proud to admit you needed us," Thomas finished quietly. "Just like you taught us to be." The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of distance and unspoken words. "I'm sorry," Harold finally said, "for everything, for not reaching out, for letting you think we were fine when we weren't, for being too stubborn to ask for help." "Dad," Thomas's voice broke, "you don't have to apologize, you just have to let us back in." Their daughter, Sarah, flew from Chicago to visit them in their new apartment. She brought her children, twin girls, 8 years old, who had never met their grandparents in person. Harold and Margaret had only seen them through blurry video calls and photographs that arrived less and less frequently as the years passed. The reunion was awkward at first. The girls were shy, hiding behind their mother's legs. Sarah was cautious, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Too much time had passed. Too many wounds had been left to fester. But then Margaret pulled out a bag of cookies she had baked that morning, chocolate chip, Sarah's favorite from childhood. And something shifted. Sarah took one bite and burst into tears. "Mama," she sobbed, "I'm so sorry. I should have been there. I should have helped." Margaret held her daughter while she cried, stroking her hair the way she had when Sarah was small. "You're here now. That's all that matters." The girls warmed up quickly after that. They explored every corner of the small apartment, asked 1,000 questions about Spain, and insisted on hearing the story of how their grandparents had found the hidden treasure. Harold told it like a fairy tale, complete with sound effects and dramatic pauses, and by the end, both girls were hanging on his every word. "Grandpa," one of them whispered, her eyes wide, "are you a superhero?" Harold laughed and kissed her forehead. "No, sweetheart, just a regular person who tried to do the right thing." But she shook her head firmly. "That's what superheroes do." Boris Becker's legal troubles deepened with each passing week. The discovery of the hidden vault had reopened investigations that prosecutors thought were closed. New charges were filed in Germany, Spain, and the United Kingdom. Financial regulators launched inquiries into the banks and law firms that had helped move the money. The network unraveled slowly at first, then all at once. A Swiss banker was arrested for money laundering. A Spanish lawyer had his license revoked. A London-based fixer fled to a country with no extradition treaty, one step ahead of investigators. And at the center of it all sat the evidence that Harold and Margaret had discovered. The ledgers, the account records, the transfer documents that traced every euro from its origin to its hiding place beneath the tennis court. Becker himself faced new proceedings. The original charges from his 2017 bankruptcy were revisited. Prosecutors argued that his concealment of assets was far more extensive than previously understood, that he had deliberately deceived courts and creditors for years. The former tennis champion, once celebrated for his athletic brilliance, became a symbol of something darker. The wealthy elite who believed the rules didn't apply to them, who hid fortunes while ordinary people suffered. Harold and Margaret followed the proceedings from their apartment, watching news coverage with the same disbelief they had felt since the beginning. "I almost feel sorry for him," Margaret said one evening, watching footage of Becker leaving a German courthouse, his face haggard, surrounded by lawyers. Harold raised an eyebrow. After everything he did? Not for what he did, for who he became. Margaret shook her head. He had everything: fame, money, talent. And he threw it all away for more than he could ever spend, more than he could ever need. And now look at him. Harold considered this. Maybe that's the lesson. Enough is never enough for some people. They keep grabbing and grabbing until there's nothing left but the grabbing itself. "And we had nothing," Margaret said softly. "Nothing but each other. And we still found a way to give something back." She leaned her head on his shoulder. Outside, the sun was setting over Palmer Harbor, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The final interview request came from an American network, one of the big ones, the kind that reached millions of viewers across the United States and beyond. They wanted Harold and Margaret to tell their story one more time, to share the lessons they had learned, to speak directly to people who might be facing their own impossible choices. Sophia helped them prepare. She coached them on what to expect, how to handle difficult questions, how to stay calm under the bright lights and probing cameras. The interview took place on their small balcony overlooking the Mediterranean. The American journalist was professional but warm, putting them at ease with small talk before the cameras rolled. "Let's start at the beginning," she said. "Tell me about your life before all of this." And so they did. They talked about Arizona, about the home they had loved and lost, about 47 years of marriage and 2 children, and a dream of retiring somewhere beautiful, about the Ponzi scheme that destroyed everything and the shame that kept them silent. They talked about the months of homelessness, the nights sleeping in their car, the cold and hunger and fear, about finding the villa and slowly making it their own, about the moment they discovered the vault and stood surrounded by more wealth than they could comprehend. "And you chose to walk away from it," the journalist said. $275 million, and you reported it instead of taking it. Why? Harold looked at Margaret. She nodded slightly, giving him permission to speak for both of them. "Because that money had victims," he said. "Every euro in that vault represented someone who had been cheated. Pensioners who lost their retirement. Businesses that went bankrupt. A charity that couldn't help the kids they were meant to serve." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "We lost our savings to a con man. We know what that feels like. The anger, the shame, the helplessness. We couldn't become the same kind of people who made us feel that way. It would have destroyed us worse than the poverty ever did." The journalist leaned forward. "But you were homeless. You were desperate. Surely the thought crossed your mind." "Of course it did," Margaret interjected. "We're human. We thought about what that money could buy. Security, comfort, a future without worry." She smiled sadly. "But then we thought about who we would become if we took it, and we realized that no amount of money is worth losing yourself." "You've become heroes to many people," the journalist said. "How does that feel?" Harold shifted uncomfortably. "We're not heroes. We're just regular folks who made a hard choice. The real heroes are the people who kept fighting for justice, even when it seemed hopeless. The prosecutors who never gave up. The creditors who kept pushing for accountability. We just happened to find a piece of the puzzle." "But you found the whole puzzle," the journalist pressed. You found everything. Doesn't that make you special?" Margaret shook her head. "It makes us lucky. Lucky that we stumbled onto that villa. Lucky that we had the skills to trace the electrical systems. Lucky that we met Sophia, who knew how to bring the truth to light." She reached for Harold's hand. "The only thing we did that was truly ours was the choice to come forward. And that's not special. That's just being decent." The journalist was quiet for a moment, moved by their humility. "One final question," she said. "What would you say to someone watching this who might be facing their own impossible choice? Someone who has the opportunity to do something wrong but profitable, or something right but costly?" Harold and Margaret looked at each other. Nearly 50 years of marriage passed between them in that glance. All the joy and sorrow, the struggles and triumphs, the quiet moments of love that no camera could capture. "I'd say that your choices define you more than your circumstances," Harold said finally. "Life will knock you down. It'll take things from you that you thought you'd never lose. But it can't take your integrity unless you let it." Margaret nodded. "And I'd say that doing the right thing isn't always rewarded. Sometimes it costs you everything. But when you lay your head down at night, you can sleep. And when you look at the people you love, you don't have to be ashamed." She squeezed Harold's hand. "We lost our money, our home, our security, but we never lost who we are. And in the end, that's worth more than $275 million. It's worth more than anything." The interview aired on a Sunday evening, prime time in the United States. Millions of people watched. Letters and emails poured in from around the world, from people who had been inspired, who had been challenged, who had looked at their own lives and wondered if they could make the same choice. Some wrote to share their own stories of loss and recovery. Others wrote to thank Harold and Margaret for restoring their faith in humanity. A few wrote to confess their own moral failings, as if the elderly couple's example had given them permission to acknowledge truths they had long buried. One letter stood out from the rest. It came from Germany, written in careful English, signed simply, "A Mother." "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Cole, I am the mother of 3 children. My husband worked for a company that invested heavily based on Boris Becker's supposed wealth. When the truth came out, the company collapsed. My husband lost his job. We lost our home. My youngest daughter had to leave university. For years I have been angry at Becker, angry at the system that let him hide his crimes, angry at the world for being so unfair. But watching your interview, something changed. I saw 2 people who had suffered as much as we did, maybe more, and instead of anger, I saw peace. Instead of bitterness, I saw grace. You taught me that holding on to rage only poisons the person holding it. You taught me that integrity is not about what happens to us, but about how we respond. My family will receive compensation from the recovered assets, but more valuable than any money is the lesson you have given us. We can be victims without being defeated. We can lose everything and still keep our souls. Thank you. Thank you for showing us the way." Margaret read the letter aloud to Harold on their balcony as the sun set over the harbour. When she finished, neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Harold said, "That's why we did it. That letter, that family, that's the reason." Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I know." They sat together in the fading light, 2 elderly Americans at the end of a journey they never expected. Behind them lay poverty and homelessness, fear and desperation. Ahead lay something they had almost forgotten was possible: hope. The apartment around them was modest but comfortable. The pension would keep them fed and housed for whatever years remained. Their children and grandchildren had returned to their lives, and somewhere out there, thousands of people were rebuilding because of a choice made in a hidden vault beneath a tennis court. Harold reached over and took Margaret's hand. Her skin was papery now, marked with age spots and the passage of time, but her grip was still strong, still sure, still the same grip that had held him through 49 years of marriage. "Maggie," he said softly. "Yes?" "Do you remember what you said to me that night in the vault when we were trying to decide what to do?" Margaret thought back to that moment, the stacks of cash surrounding them, the gold gleaming in their flashlight beams, the weight of an impossible choice pressing down on their shoulders. "I said we lost our money, but we never lost who we are." Harold nodded. "That's what I want on my tombstone. Not the awards or the medals or the newspaper headlines, just that." Margaret smiled through her tears. "I think that can be arranged." They watched the last light fade from the sky, the stars emerging one by one over the ancient city. Somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring, marking the passage of another day. Harold and Margaret Cole had started with nothing and ended with everything that mattered. Not money, not fame, not the recognition of kings and governments. Just each other and the quiet knowledge that when the world had tested them, they had not been found wanting. The vault beneath the tennis court was empty now, its contents distributed to those who had been wronged. The villa had been seized by authorities, its secrets exposed to the light of day. Boris Becker faced justice for his crimes, but the true treasure had never been the money. It had been the choice, the decision made by two ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances to be better than the forces that had tried to break them. And that treasure, unlike the gold and currency and bearer bonds, could never be taken away. It would live forever. Anyone can choose honesty when it's easy, but choosing it when $275 million sits in front of you and no one is watching, that's the kind of courage that changes the world. As the morning sun warmed the stone balcony of their small apartment overlooking Palmer Harbor, Harold and Margaret Cole sat together with cups of coffee gone cold, watching fishing boats return with their morning catch. They had lost count of how many mornings like this they had shared now, simple, peaceful, unimaginable just 2 years before. They never forgot where they came from. The car they had slept in still sat in the parking lot of their building, kept not from necessity but from remembrance. They visited food banks sometimes, not to receive but to give. They wrote letters to the creditors whose lives had been rebuilt and received letters in return. And they told their story whenever anyone asked, not for glory, but for purpose, because somewhere out there, someone else was facing an impossible choice. Someone else was standing at the edge of a vault, literal or metaphorical, wondering whether integrity was worth the cost. For Harold and Margaret Cole, the answer would always be yes. Not because it was easy, not because it was rewarded, but because some things matter more than money, more than comfort, more than survival itself. Some things like love and honor and the ability to look at yourself in the mirror are priceless. And those things, they had discovered, were the only fortune worth keeping. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories of hope, heart, and impossible choices. Click to keep watching with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that integrity is worth more than gold.